Chapter 22 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 22. Robert Taylor. Many of the readers of this number will, from their own memories, be better able to do justice to him, whom Henry Hunt named the Devil's Chaplain, than we shall in our limited space. Robert Taylor was born at Edmonton, in the county of Middlesex, on the 18th of August, 1784. His family was highly respectable, and his parents were in affluent circumstances. But, being a younger son in a family of 11 children, it was necessary that Robert Taylor should follow some profession. His father died when he was about 7 years old, leaving him under the guardianship of a paternal uncle. When 17 years of age, he was apprenticed to a surgeon at Birmingham, and studied medicine afterward under Sir Astley Cooper and Mr. Clive, passing the College of Surgeons with considerable eclat. When about 23, he became acquainted with the Reverend Thomas Cotterell, a clergyman of the Established Church, of high evangelical principles, who induced him to quit physics for metaphysics, and in 1809 Robert Taylor entered St. John's College, Cambridge, and in 1813 took his degree of Bachelor of Arts. He was publicly complimented by the master of the college as a singular honor to the university in his scholarship, and was ordained on the 14th of March, 1813, by the Bishop of Chichester. From that time until 1818, Taylor officiated as curate at Midhurst. Here he became acquainted with a person named Ayling, who held deistical opinions, and who induced Taylor to read various free-thinking works. This soon resulted in an avowal of deism on the part of Taylor, who tendered his resignation to his bishop. His friends and family were much alarmed, and much pressure was brought to bear upon him, and we regret to state that it had the effect of producing a temporary recantation. This, however, brought Taylor no relief. He found himself in distress, and shunned by his family. Through the kindness of an old friend, he obtained the curacy of Yardley, near Birmingham, but his previous apostasy having reached the ears of the bishop, the necessary license was refused, and the rector received a peremptory notice to dismiss Taylor. This harsh treatment caused a reaction, and while the rector sought another curate, Taylor preached a series of sermons, by means of which he shook the faith of nearly the whole of his congregation. The following is an abstract of his last sermon at Yardley. The text was, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Matthew 12:40. He began. Then this glorious miracle of the man having been swallowed alive by a fish, and remaining alive for 72 hours, undigested and unhurt, in the fish's bowels, and being vomited up unhurt and safe upon the dry land, was as true as the gospel. And consequently the gospel was as true, but not more true than this seasick miracle. He inferred that no person could have a right to pretend to believe in the death and resurrection of Christ, who had the least doubt as to the reality of the deglutition and evomition of the prophet Jonah. As to the natural improbabilities and physical impossibilities of this very wonderful Bible miracle, these were nothing in the way of a true and lively faith. Where miracles of any sort were concerned, there could be no distinction into the greater and the less, since infinite power was as necessary to the reality of the least as to the greatest. We should never forget that it was the Lord who prepared the fish, and prepared him for the express purpose of swallowing the man, and probably gave him a little opening physic to cleanse the apartment for the accommodation of its intended tenant; and had the purpose been that the whole ship and all the crew should have been swallowed as well as he, there's no doubt that they could have been equally well accommodated. But as to what some wicked infidels objected, about the swallow of the whale being too narrow to admit the passage of the man, it only required a little stretching, and even a herring or a sprat might have gulped him. He enlarged most copiously on the circumstance of the Lord speaking to the fish, in order to cause him to vomit, and insisted on the natural efficacy of the Lord, which was quite enough to make anybody sick. He pointed out the many interesting examples of faith and obedience which had been set by the scaly race, who were not only at all times easy to be caught in the gospel net, when thrown over them by the preaching of the word, but were always ready to surrender their existence to the Almighty whenever he pleased to drop 'em a line. That as the first preachers of the gospel were fishermen, so the preachers of the gospel to this day might truly be said to be looking after the loaves and fishes, and they who, as the scripture says, are wise to catch souls, soules, speak to them for no other purpose than that for which the Lord spake unto the whale, that is, to ascertain how much they can swallow. The moral of this pungent persiflage, aimed to admonish the proud and uncharitable believer, who expected his acceptance with the Deity on the score of his credulity, that when his credulity was fairly put to trial, it might be found that he was in reality as far from believing what he did not take to be true as the most honest and avowed infidel. Thou then who wouldst put a trick upon infinite wisdom, and preferrest the imagined merit of a weak understanding to the real utility of an honest heart, thou who wouldst compound for sins thou art inclined to, by damning those hast no mind to. Hast thou no fears for thy presumptuous self? Thou believest only that which seemeth to thee to be true. And what does the atheist less? And that which appeareth to be a lie thou rejectest. What does the atheist more? Can we think that God has given us reason only to betray us, and made us so much superior to the brute creation only to deal with us so much worse than they, to punish us for making the best use we could of the faculties he has given us, and to make the very excellence of our nature the cause of our damnation? This concluded his connection with the Church of England, and his brother having consented to make him an allowance of £1 per week if he would quit England, he retired to the Isle of Man. After 9 weeks his brother ceased to remit, and to support himself, Taylor wrote for the 2 newspapers then published in the island. But his articles attracting attention, he was summoned before the bishop, and compelled to quit the island under a threat of imprisonment. In deep distress, he went to Dublin, where he lectured on Deism until 1824, when he came to London and founded the Christian Evidence Society. Many of the disclosures delivered by him were printed in The Lion, which was first published in 1828. In 1827, Mr. Taylor was tried at Guildhall for blasphemy, and was sentenced to imprisonment in Oakham jail for 1 year. In Oakham he wrote the Diegesis and the Syntagma. After his release from prison in 1829, he, together with Richard Carlile, made a tour through England on an infidel mission, commencing with a challenge to the Cambridge University. In 1830 and 1831 he delivered a series of discourses which are printed together under the title of "The Devil's Pulpit." On the 4th of July, 1831, he was again tried for blasphemy and sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. In 1833 he delivered a number of discourses, which were printed in the Philalethean. He was the friend and companion of Richard Carlile for several years. It is difficult to quote from Robert Taylor's works, unless at the risk of doing him great injustice, and we must therefore refer our readers to the works we have named. The following is from The Devil's Pulpit. The gentlemen who distribute religious tracts, the general body of dissenting preachers, and almost all persons engaged in the trade of religion, imagine themselves to have a mighty advantage against infidels, upon the strength of that last and reckless argument, that whether the Christian religion be true or false, there can be no harm in believing, and that belief is, at any rate, the safe side. Now, to say nothing of this old popish argument, which a sensible man must see is the very essence of popery, and would oblige us to believe all the absurdities and nonsense in the world, inasmuch as if there be no harm in believing, and there be some harm and danger in not believing, the more we believe the better, and all the argument necessary for any religion whatever would be, that it should frighten us out of our wits. The more terrible, the more true, and it would be our duty to become the converts of that religion, whatever it might be, whose priests could swear the loudest, and damn and curse the fiercest. But I am here to grapple with this popery in disguise, this wolfish argument in sheepish clothing, upon scriptural ground, and on scriptural ground only, taking the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, for this argument's sake, to be divine authority. The question proposed is, whether is the believer or the unbeliever the more likely to be saved, taking the scriptures to be of divine authority? And I stand here on this divine authority to prove that the unbeliever is the more likely to be saved, that unbelief and not belief is the safe side, and that a man is more likely to be damned for believing the gospel, and because of his having believed it, than for rejecting and despising it as I do. But if a patient hearing be more than good Christians be minded to give us, when thus advanced to meet them on their own ground, their impatience and intolerance itself will supply the evidence and demonstration of the fact that, after all, they dare not stand to the text of their own book, that it is not the Bible that they go by, nor God whom they regard, but that they want to be God Almighty's themselves, and would have us take their words for God's words. You must read it as they read it, and understand it as they understand it. You must skip and go on just where a hard word comes in the way of the sense they choose to put upon it. You must believe what the book contains, what you see with your own eyes that it does not contain. You must shut your eyes and not see what it does contain, or you'll be none the nearer the mark of their liking. Taking the authority of Scripture for this argument's sake to be decisive, I address the believer who would give himself airs of superiority, would chuckle in an imaginary safety in believing, and presume to threaten the unbeliever as being in a worse case, or more dangerous plight than he. Hast thou no fears for thy presumptuous self, when on the showing of thine own book, the safety, if safety there be, is all on the unbelieving side? When for any one text that can be produced, seeming to hold out any advantage or safety in believing, we can produce two in which the better hope is held out to the unbeliever. For any one apparent exhortation to believe, we can produce two forbiddances to believe, and many threatenings of God's vengeance to, and for the crime and folly of, believing. To this proof I proceed by showing you, first, what the denunciations of God's vengeance are, with no comment of mine, but in the words of the text itself. Second, that these dreadful denunciations are threatened to believers, and that they are not threatened to unbelievers. And third, that all possible advantages and safety which believing could confer on any man are likely, and more likely, to be conferred on the unbeliever than on the believer. That the danger of the believer is so extreme, that no greater danger can possibly be. First, what are the denunciations of God's vengeance? There are, says the Holy Revelation, 14:10, who shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, and shall be tormented with fire and brimstone, and the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night. There's glad tidings of great joy for you. The Christian may get over the terror of this denunciation by the selfish and ungenerous chuckle of his, well, these were very wicked people, and must have deserved their doom. It need not alarm us. It doesn't apply to us. But good-hearted men would rather say it does apply. We cannot be indifferent to the misery of our fellow creatures. The self same heaven that frowns on them looks lowering upon us. And who were they? And what was their offense? Was it atheism? Was it deism? Was it infidelity? No! It was for church and chapel going. It was for adoring, believing, and worshiping. They worshipped the beast. I know not what beast they worship, but I know that if you go into any of our churches and chapels at this day, you will find them worshipping the Lamb, and if worshipping a lamb be not most suspiciously like worshipping a beast, you may keep the color in your cheeks, while mine are blanched with fear. The unbeliever only can be absolutely safe from this danger. He only who has no religion at all is sure not to be of the wrong religion. He who worships neither God nor devil is sure not to mistake one of those gentlemen for the other. But will it be pretended that these are only metaphors of speech, that the thing said is not the thing that's meant? Why, then, they are very ugly metaphors. And what is saying that which you don't mean, and meaning the contrary to what you say, but lying? And what worse can become of the infidel, who makes it the rule of his life to hear and speak the plain and simple truth, than of the Christian, whose religion itself is a system of metaphors and allegories, of double meanings, of quirk and quiddities, in dread defiance of the text that warns him that all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone. Revelation 21:8. Is it a parable that man may merely entertain his imagination withal, and think no more on't? Though not a word be hinted about a parabolical signification, and the text stands in the mouth of him who, we are told, was the truth itself, and he it is who brought life and immortality to light, that hath described in the 16th of Luke such an immortality as that of one who was a sincere believer, a son of Abraham, who took the Bible for the rule of his life, and was anxious to promote the salvation of his brethren, yet found for himself no Savior, no salvation, But in hell he lifteth up his eyes, being in torment, and saith, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But that request was refused. Then he said, I pray thee, therefore, Father, that thou wouldst send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come to this place of torment. But that request was refused. There's glad tidings of great joy for you, that the believer's danger of coming or going into that place of torment is so great, that greater cannot possibly be, and that his belief will stand him in no stead at all, but make his plight 1,000 times worse than if he had not been a believer, and that unbelief is the safer side, Christ himself being judge. I quote no words but his to prove. Is the believer concerned to save his soul, then shall he most assuredly be damned for being so concerned. For Christ hath said, Whosoever will save his soul shall lose it. Matthew 16:25. Is the believer a complete beggar? If he be not so, if he hath a rag that he doth call his own, he will be damned to all eternity. For Christ hath said, Whosoever he be of you who forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. Luke 14:33. Is the believer a rich man, and dreams he of going to heaven? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Matthew 19:24. Is he a man at all? Then he cannot be saved. For Christ hath said, Thou believest that there is one God, saith St. James. Thou dost well, the devils also believe and tremble. 2 James 19. And so much good, and no more than comes to damned spirits in the flames of hell, is all the good that ever did and can come of believing. For though thou hadst all faith, so that thou couldst remove mountains, saith St. Paul, it should profit thee nothing. 1 Corinthians 13:2. Well, then, let the good Christian try what saving his prayers will do for him. This is the good that they'll do for him, and he hath Christ's own word to comfort him in it. He shall receive the greater damnation. Luke 20:47. Well, then, since believing will not save him, since faith will not save him, since prayer will not save him, but all so positively make things all the worse and none the better, there's one other chance for him. Let him go and receive the sacrament, the most comfortable sacrament, you know, of the body and blood of Christ, remembering, as all good communicants should, that he is not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs that fall from that table. Truth, Lord, but dogs eat of the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Oh, what happy dogs! But let those dogs remember that it is also truth, that he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself. 1 Corinthians 16:29. Oh, what precious eating and drinking! My God, is this thy table spread, and doth thy cup with love o'erflow? Thither be all the children led, and let them all thy sweetness know. That table is a snare, that cup is deadly poison, that bread shall send thy soul to hell. Well, then, try again, believer. Perhaps you had better join the missionary society, and subscribe to send these glad tidings of these blessed privileges, and this jolly eating and drinking to the heathen. Why, then, you have Christ's own assurance, that when you shall have made one proselyte, you shall just have done him the kindness of making him twofold more the child of hell than yourself. Matthew 23:15. Is the believer liable to the ordinary gusts of passion, and in a passion shall he drop the hasty word, "Thou fool!" For that one word he shall be in danger of hell fire. Matthew 5:22. Nay, sirs, this isn't the worst of the believer's danger. Would he but keep his legs and arms together, and spare his own eyes and limbs, he doth by that very mercy to himself damn his eyes and limbs, and hath Christ's assurance that it would have been profitable for him rather to have plucked out his eyes, and chopped off his limbs, and so to have wriggled and groped his way through the strait gate and the narrow way that leadeth unto life, than having 2 eyes and 2 arms, or 2 legs, to be cast into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. Mark 9:43. Well, then, will the believer say, what were all the miracles and prophecies of both the Old and New Testament for those unquestionable miracles, and clearly accomplished prophecies, if it were not that men should believe? Why, absolutely, they were the very arguments appointed by God himself to show us that men should not believe, but that damnation should be their punishment if they did believe. To the law and the testimony, sir, these are the very words of miracles, saith God's words. They are the spirits of devils that work miracles. Revelations 16:14. And it is the devil who deceiveth them which dwell on the earth, by means of those miracles which he hath power to do. Revelations 13:14. So much for miracles. Is it on the score of prophets and of prophecies, then, that you will take believing to be the safe side? Then thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests bear rule by their means. Jeremiah 5:31. The prophet is a fool, the spiritual man is mad. Hosea 1:7. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, hearken not unto the prophets. Jeremiah 23:15. O Israel, thy prophets are like the foxes of the desert. Ezekiel 13:4. They lie unto thee. Jeremiah 14:14. And they shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Revelations 20:10. And the punishment of the prophet shall be even as the punishment of him that seeketh unto him. Ezekiel 14:10. Nay, more then it is when God hath determined to damn men, that he in every instance causeth them to become believers, and to have faith in divine revelation, in order that they may be damned. Believers and none but believers becoming liable to damnation, believers and none but believers being capable of committing that unpardonable sin against the Holy Ghost, which hath never forgiveness, neither in this world nor in that which is to come. Whereas all other kinds of blasphemy shall be forgiven unto men, and all sorts of blasphemy wherewith soever they shall blaspheme, but there is no forgiveness for believers. Mark 3:28. For it is written, for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be damned. 2 Thessalonians 2:11. So when it was determined by God that the wicked Ahab should perish, the means to bring him to destruction, both of body and soul, was to make him become a believer. I offer no comment of my own on words so sacred, but these are the words. Hear thou, therefore, the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting upon his throne, and all the hosts of heaven standing by him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who shall persuade Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said on this manner, and another said on that manner. And there stood forth a spirit, and stood before the Lord, and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said unto him, Wherewith? And he said, I will go forth, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, Thou shalt persuade him, and prevail also. Go forth, and do so. Now, therefore, behold, the Lord hath put a lying spirit in the mouth of all thy prophets. 1 Kings 22:22. There were 400 of them. They were the goodly fellowship of the prophets for you. All of them inspired by the Spirit from on high, and all of them lying as fast as they could lie. So much for getting on the safe side by believing. Had Ahab been an infidel, he would have saved his soul alive. As it was, we may address him in the words of St. Paul to just such another fool. King Ahab, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest, but no better than I know that for that very belief fell slaughter on thy soul, and where thou soughtest to be saved by believing, it was by believing thou wert damned. So when Elijah had succeeded in converting the 450 worshippers of Baal, who had been safe enough while they were infidels, and they began crying, The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. The moment they got into the right faith, they found themselves in the wrong box. And the prophet, by the command of God, put a stop to their Lord Godding by cutting their throats for them. Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon and slew them there. 1 Kings 18:40. Oh, what a blessed thing, you see, to be converted to the true faith. Thus all the sins and crimes that have been committed in the world, and all God's judgments upon sin and sinners, have been the consequence of religion and faith and believing. What was the first sin committed in the world? It was believing. Had our great mother Eve not been a believing, credulous fool, she would not have been in the transgression. Who was the first reverend divine that began preaching about God and immortality? It was the devil. What was the first lie that was ever told? The very damning and damnable lie. It was the lie told to make folks believe that they would not be dead when they were dead. That they should not surely die, that they should be as gods and live in a future state of existence, when God himself hath declared that there is no future state of existence, that dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Who is it then that prefers believing in the devil rather than in God, but the believer? And from whom is the hope of a future state derived, but from the father of lies, the devil? But if, in defiance of so positive a declaration of Almighty God, men will have it that there is a future state of existence after death, who are they who shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but unbelievers? Let them come from the north, from the south, from the east, or from the west. And who are they that shall be cast out? But believers, the children of the kingdom. As St. Peter very charitably calls them, cursed children. 2 Peter 2:14. That is, I suppose, children with beards, children that never grew to sense enough to put away childish things, but did in gawky manhood, like newborn babes, desire the pure milk and lollipop of the gospel. For of such is the kingdom of heaven. And who are they whom Christ will set upon his right hand, and to whom he will say, Come, ye blessed of my Father? But unbelievers, who never troubled their minds about religion, and never darken the doors of a gospel shop. But who are they to whom he will say, Depart, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels? But believers, every one of them believers, chapel-going folks, Christ's blood men, and incorrigible bigots, that had been bothering him all their days with their Lord, Lord, to come off at last with no better reward of their faith than that he will protest unto them, I never knew ye. One text there is, and only one, against 10,000 of a contrary significancy, which, being garbled and torn from its context, seems for a moment to give the advantage to the believer. The celebrated 19th chapter of Mark, 5:16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. But little will this serve the deceitful hope of the Christian, for it is immediately added, and these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. Can the Christian show these signs, or any of them? Will he dare to take up a serpent, or drink prussic acid? If he hesitate, he is not a believer, and his profession of belief is a falsehood. Let belief confer what privilege it may, he hath no part nor lot in the matter. The threat which he denounces against infidels hangs over himself, and he hath no sign of salvation to show. Believing the gospel, then, or rather I should say professing to believe it, for I need not tell you that there's a great deal more professing to believe than believing, instead of making a man the more likely to be saved, doubles his danger of damnation, inasmuch as Christ hath said that the last state of that man shall be worse than the first. Luke 11:26. And his holy apostle Peter addeth, it would have been better for them not to have known the way. 2 Peter 2:21 of righteousness. The sin of believing makes all other sins that a man can commit so much the more heinous and offensive in the sight of God, inasmuch as they are sins against light and knowledge. And the servant who knew his Lord's will and did it not, he shall be beaten with many stripes. Luke 12:47. While unbelief is not only innocent in itself, but so highly pleasing to Almighty God, that it is represented as the cause of his forgiveness of things which otherwise would not be forgiven. Thus St. Paul, who had been a blasphemer, a prosecutor, and injurious, assures us that it was for this cause he obtained mercy, because he did it ignorantly in unbelief. 1 Timothy 1:13. Had he been a believer, he would as surely have been damned as his name was Paul. And 'tis the gist of his whole argument, and the express words of the 11th of the Epistle to the Romans, that God included them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. Unbelief being the essential qualification and recommendation to God's mercy. Not without good reason was it that the pious father of the boy that had the devil in him, when he had need of Christ's mercy, and knew that unbelief would be the best title to it, cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Mark 9:24. While the apostles themselves, who were most immediately near and dear to Christ, no more believed the gospel than I do, and for all they have said and preached about it, they never believed it themselves, as Christ told them that they hadn't so much faith as a grain of mustard seed. And the evangelist John bears them record, to their immortal honor, that though Christ had done so many miracles among them, yet believed they not. John 12:37. And the same divine authority assures us that neither did his brethren believe in him. John 7:5. Which then is the safe side, sirs, on the showing of the record itself? On the unbelieving side, the infidel stands in the glorious company of the apostles, in the immediate family of Christ, and hath no fear, while the believer doth as well, and no better than the devils in hell, who believe and tremble. End section 22 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Chapter 23 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 23, Joseph Barker. In any work purporting to be a true record of freethinkers, the name of Joseph Barker cannot be omitted. We find in him, from the commencement of his public life till the present time, an ardent desire for, and a determination to achieve, freedom of thought and expression on all subjects appertaining to theology, politics, and sociology. Possessing a vigorous intellect, a constitution naturally strong, great oratorical ability, and an unrivaled command of the Saxon language, he has made himself a power among each party with whom the transitory state of his mind has brought him in contact. It is seldom we find men with equal boldness, when once connected with Wesleyan Methodism, rising superior in thought to its narrow, selfish, dogmatic, unnatural, and humiliating views, and claiming for human nature a more dignified and exalted position, gradually advancing to Unitarianism, ultimately to land safely on the shore of materialism. Joseph Barker has passed, amid persecution and privation, through these different phases of theology, to arrive at infidelity, to be, he states, a better, wiser, and happier man. In his autobiography we read that he was born in Bramley, an old country town in the West Riding of Yorkshire, in 1806, the day of his birth being forgotten. His parents and his ancestors, so far as is known of them, were of humble means. His grandfather was addicted to drinking freely of those beverages which meet with so much opposition from Mr. Barker himself. His aunt also was unfortunate, having married a man who was a minister, a drunkard, and a cockfighter. His parents appear to have been uneducated and pious, belonging to the old school of Methodists, those who look on this life merely as a state of trial and probation, always looking forward to enjoy their mansion in the skies, the house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens, thinking nothing worth a thought beneath, but how they may escape the death that never, never dies. Although living in this world, they were not of it. It was to them all vanity and vexation of spirit. They attended their chapel, their love feasts, their class meetings, their prayer meetings, and their revival meetings, where they would lament over the wickedness and depravity of human nature, where they would speak their experience, tell of their temptations, pray for the conversion of the world, and sing their hymns, such as the following, which was a favorite with Mr. Barker's family: Refining fire, go through my heart, illuminate my soul, scatter my life through every part, and sanctify the whole. Such being the character of Mr. Barker's parents, it is no wonder that he was brought up under the same influence, with the same false notions of life, of humanity, and of the world; and we cannot prize too highly the man who had the industry to investigate, the ability to discern, and the courage to expose the falsity of such doctrines, and the disastrous effects of such teaching. In the extracts we shall give from Mr. Barker's works will be found that simplicity of style and force of argument peculiar to himself. The first extract we take shows the falsity of the orthodox doctrine of the total depravity of human nature. On looking back on the earlier periods of my life, I first see proofs that the orthodox doctrine of original sin, or of natural total depravity, is a falsehood. I was not born totally depraved. I never recollect the time since I began to think and feel at all when I had not good thoughts and good feelings. I never recollect the time since I began to think and feel at all when I had not many good thoughts and strong inclinations to goodness. So far was my heart from being utterly depraved or hardened, that I sympathized, even in my childhood, with the humblest of God's creatures, and was filled to overflowing with sorrow at the sight of distress. I recollect one Sunday, while I was searching about for something in one of the windows upstairs, I found a butterfly that had been starved to death, as I supposed. When I laid hold of it, it crumbled to pieces. My feelings were such at the thought of the poor butterfly's sufferings, that I wept, and for all that day I could scarcely open my lips to say a word to any one without bursting into tears. And I recollect well what a struggle I had when I first told a lie. A school in the neighborhood had a feast. Ours had not. So I played the truant, after a serious struggle, to have an opportunity of seeing their scholars walk. I had a miserable afternoon, for I felt that I was doing wrong, and I was afraid lest my mother should find me out. My sister found me out, and told my mother, but my mother was loath to believe her, till she had asked me myself. When I went home, my mother asked me if I had been to school, and I said yes. And my mother, as she had never found me out in a lie before, believed me. But I was sadly distressed afterwards when I thought of what I had done. That lie caused me days of remorse, and my sufferings were all the severer in consequence of my mother having so readily believed what I had said. The unhappy and unnatural effects of theology on the minds of earnest, truth-seeking men, the total prostration of manly dignity, the perversion of the mental faculties, and the debasement of human nature, is truly stated by Mr. Barker in the following extract. I also recollect being very much troubled with dreadful and indescribably awful dreams, and for several months during certain parts of the year I was accustomed to rise during my sleep and walk about the house in a state of sleep for hours together. I say in a state of sleep, but I cannot exactly describe the state in which I was. It was not perfect sleep, and yet I was not properly awake. My eyes were open, and I saw, as far as I can remember, the things around me, and I could hear what was said to me. but neither what I saw nor what I heard seemed to have power to penetrate far enough into my soul to awake me properly. During those occasions I was frequently very unhappy, dreadfully unhappy, most horribly miserable. Sometimes I fancied I had been doing something wrong, and my fancied offence seemed horrible beyond all expression, and alarmed and overwhelmed me with unutterable terrors and distress. On one occasion, I fancied that both I and my father had both been doing something wrong, and this seemed most horrible and distressing of all, and as I wandered about in my mysterious state, I howled most piteously, and cried and wept as if my heart would break. I never recollect being roused from that dismal state while I was walking around the house except twice. Once, when I struck my shins violently against a large earthenware bowl, and hurt myself sadly; and another was when I was attempting to go up the chimney. I put my foot upon fire, and burnt myself, and that awoke me. I suffered in this way for several years. After I went to bed at night, I soon fell asleep, and slept perhaps an hour or nearly 2. I would then begin to cry, or moan, or howl, and at times to sing. One night I sang a whole hymn of 8 verses through, the hymn in Wesley's hymn book beginning, "With glorious clouds encompassed round, whom angels dimly see, will the unsearchable be found, or God appear to me." Few persons who have not attended the class meetings of the Wesleyan Methodists can form an adequate idea of the stereotyped phrases and absurd sayings indulged in by those who "speak their experience," etc., at those meetings. Certain sentences are learned and uttered indiscriminately, without reference to time, place, or other conditions. Mr. Barker, after speaking of the recklessness of speech thus indulged in, says: "In many cases, this false way of speaking is the result of mere thoughtlessness, perhaps, or of ignorance, joined with the notion that it is their duty to pray, or to say something in public. The parties have no intention to deceive, but being called on to speak, or invited to pray, they begin, and catch hold of such words as they can find, whether right or wrong, whether true or false, and their words are oftener foolish or false than wise or true. Their talk is at times most foolish and ridiculous. I will give an example or two. It is customary for people, when praying for preachers, to say, 'Lord, bless thy servants when they stand up to declare thy word. Be thou mouth matter and wisdom to them.' This has some meaning in it when offered in reference to a preacher, especially a preacher about to preach. In other cases it would be most foolish and ridiculous. Yet I once heard a person in a prayer meeting at Chester use this same form of expression in behalf of the sick and the dying. 'O Lord,' said he, 'bless the sick and the afflicted, and those that are in the article of death. Be thou mouth, matter, and wisdom to them.' At another prayer meeting at Chester, on a Friday evening, one of the leaders gave out the following lines: 'Another 6 days' work is done, another Sabbath is begun,' etc. I once heard a woman say in class, 'I do thank God that he ever gave me a desire to see that death that never, never dies.'" Soon after Mr. Barker became religious and attended his class meetings, he awaited the usual call to preach the gospel. Accordingly, having received the call, he became a Methodist preacher, belonging to the old connection, the new connection, and then advancing to Unitarianism, ultimately arriving at the climax of Free thought, in which cause he is now so distinguished an advocate. While a Methodist preacher, he was induced by a neighbor, an atheist, to read Carlyle's Republican. We can readily understand why Christians are taught not to read infidel works. The effect the Republican produced on Mr. Barker's mind would be augmented, did those Christians investigate what they so often ignorantly denounce. In reference to the Republican, Mr. Barker says, "I was very much struck in reading some portions of the work (Carlyle's), and agitated and shaken by its arguments on some point. The object of many of its articles was to prove Christianity irrational and false. The principal doctrines which it assailed were such as the Trinity, the common notion about the fall of man and its effects upon the human race, the Calvinistic notions of eternal, universal, and absolute predestination, unconditional election and reprobation, the Calvinistic notion of God's sovereignty or partiality, the utter depravity of every human being born into the world, and yet the obligation of those utterly depraved beings to steer clear of all evil, and to do all that is right and good, on pain of eternal damnation. The doctrine of satisfaction to justice was also assailed, and the doctrine of the immortality of the human soul, and the notion that because it is immaterial, it must, as a consequence, be immortal. The consequence was, that my mind was thrown into a state of doubt and suspense. I cannot say that I doubted the truth of the Christian religion exactly, but still I doubted the truth of certain doctrines which I had been taught to regard as parts of that religion. I can briefly describe the doubts I had. I neither saw clearly that those doctrines to which he objected were no part of the Christian religion, nor could I see any way by which these doctrines could be defended, and proved to be rational and true. One thing began to seem almost certain, either that Christianity was not true, or that those doctrines, as generally laid down, were no parts of the Christian religion. This led to investigation. I was wishful to ascertain whether those doctrines which were assailed as irrational were parts of Christianity or not. I began to converse on the subject with one of my religious companions, and I began to read on the subject as I had opportunity. My companion was rather troubled and alarmed at the doubts I expressed with respect to the correctness of some of the common doctrines of what was considered orthodoxy. Still, what I had said had some influence on his mind, for he told me shortly after that he wished he had never heard my doubts, for what I had said had spoiled some of his best sermons. He would never be able to preach them with comfort more. During my residence in that Newcastle circuit, my views on many subjects became anti-methodistical to a very great extent indeed. I now no longer held the prevailing views with respect to the nature of justifying faith, the witness of the Spirit, regeneration, sanctification, and the like. In reading Wesley's works, I was astonished at the great number of unmeaning and inconsistent passages which I met with. In many of his views I perfectly agreed with him, but with a vast amount of what he said on other subjects, I could not help but disagree. About this time, finding that there was little likelihood that I should be tolerated in the new connexion, unless I could allow my mind to be enslaved, and feeling that I should be obliged sooner or later to break loose from methodistical restraint, and speak and act with freedom, I thought of visiting Mr. Turner, the Unitarian minister of Newcastle, and seeking an interview with him. I had heard something to the effect that Unitarians were great lovers of freedom, that they did not bind their ministers and members by any human creeds, but left them at liberty to investigate the whole system of Christianity thoroughly, and to judge as to what were its doctrines and duties for themselves, and to preach what they believed to be true without restraint and persecution. And I thought if this was the case, they must be a very happy people. But from other things which I had heard respecting them, I was led to regard them with something of horror, to look on them as persons who trifled with Scripture authority, as persons who had rushed from the extremes of false orthodoxy into the extremes of infidelity. I was in consequence prevented from visiting Mr. Turner, and I remained in comparative ignorance of the Unitarian body, in ignorance both of their principles and of their character, still shut up in the dungeons of orthodox slavery. The dungeons of orthodox slavery did not long contain Mr. Barker, for he afterwards became better acquainted with the Unitarians, and formed one of their most energetic preachers. But Unitarianism, appearing to him at first true in its doctrine and free in its advocacy, shortly became insufficient for the cravings of his mind, and at length he found himself outside all the churches. The Bible, which at one period of his life seemed to him a perfect revelation from God, now appeared only the production of erring and half-informed men, and having a thorough knowledge of its contents, he resolved to employ the remainder of his life in confuting the false notions of its divine authority. America presenting a congenial residence, he resolved to visit that country and purchase some land, upon which he might occupy his leisure from lecturing and writing. Having settled in the country, he considered something should be said on the Bible. Accordingly, in November, 1852, a Bible convention was held at Salem, Ohio. Mr. Barker being appointed president, he extracted the following from his speech, as illustrating the uncertainty of the Bible translations, the character of the translators, and the nature of the manuscripts from which the translations are made. We say that the Bible bears on its very face the marks of human imperfection and error. This is true of every Bible in existence. We will begin with the Bible in common use, and what do we find? The title page tells us it is a translation from the original tongues, by the special command of one of the kings of England. Does any one pretend that the translators were infallible, men above the possibility of error? Nothing of the kind. Even those who contend that the original writers of the Bible were infallible, do not pretend that the king's translators were so. The sects and priesthoods themselves show that they regard the common translation as imperfect. They all take the liberty to alter it. They alter it in thousands and tens of thousands of places. Nothing is more common than for theological disputants to appeal from the common translation of the Bible to what they call the original Greek and Hebrew. Every commentator takes the same liberty. The leaders of the sects and priesthoods of the day have testified their belief that the Bibles in common use are imperfect and erroneous by making new translations. There is scarcely an English sect or priesthood of any note in existence that has not produced a new translation of the Scriptures. John Wesley translated both the Old and New Testament. His translation of the New Testament continues to be used in the Methodist body to this day. Adam Clarke, in his commentary, translates afresh almost every important passage in the book. Many passages he translates in such a way as to give them meanings quite contrary to the meaning given them in the common Bible. Richard Watson, a Methodist preacher, commenced a new translation of the Bible. Dr. Boothroyd, a Congregationalist minister of England, published another translation. Dr. Conquest, a layman of the same denomination, published another, in which he says he made 20,000 emendations or improvements. He must therefore have thought the common Bible had 20,000 imperfections or errors. Mr. Belsham and other English Unitarians published a new translation of the New Testament. Mr. Wellbeloved, a Unitarian minister, published a new translation of a great part of the Old Testament, intending to publish a new translation of the whole Bible. Even ministers of the established church have spoken strongly against the common translation, and some of them have gone so far as to publish new translations of portions of the Bible. Alexander Campbell, the founder of the denomination which bears his name, has published a new translation of the New Testament. A Mr. Taylor published a new translation of the New Testament from Griesbach's Greek New Testament. A Mr. Sharp published another translation from Griesbach's Greek text. The Baptists have published a new translation of the Bible, I am told. We are not alone, therefore, in believing that the Bibles in common use bear marks of human imperfection and error. The leading men in all the religious sects and priesthoods of Great Britain and America believe the same. We add, if the translators of the Bible had been the best and wisest men that ever lived, their work would not have been perfect. A translation from Greek and Hebrew cannot be perfect. But the translators employed by King James were not the best or wisest men that ever lived. They were, in some respects, exceedingly ignorant, prejudiced, and immoral. They were liars and false swearers. These dignitaries of the Church of England knew, as well as you know, that kings and queens are often vicious, profligate, and godless. They knew that among the kings and queens of England there had been some of the most loathsome lumps of filthiness, some of the most adulterous and lecherous sensualists, some of the most heartless and cruel tyrants, some of the most inhuman and bloody wretches that ever cursed the earth. They knew, too, that English kings and queens generally were under strong temptations to be thus cruel and profligate, and that it was too much to expect any of them to be strictly religious and virtuous. Yet they bound themselves on oath to call their kings and queens, whatever their characters might be, most gracious and religious. They did call the monarch then living most gracious and religious, and they handed it down as a duty to their successors to give the same high titles to all their future monarchs, though they should be as filthy as that unwieldy waddling mass of lust and rottenness, King Henry VIII., or as false and treacherous as the perjured Charles I. These translators of the Bible also knew that many who were brought to them to be buried were godless, wicked men. They knew that some of them were drunkards, adulterers, false swearers, yet they bound themselves to call them all, as they lowered them into their graves, their beloved brethren, and to declare that they committed them to the dust in sure and certain hope of a resurrection to eternal life, though they believed in their hearts that they would rise to eternal damnation. They were the hirelings of the king and government. They regarded the king as the head of the church, and were sworn to obey him in all things. They were sworn to obey him in translating the Bible. The king gave them the rules by which they were to be guided in the work of translation, and they were sworn to follow these rules. These rules were intended to prevent them from putting anything into their translation of the Bible that was at variance with the established priesthoods, and to keep them from leaving out anything that was favorable to the established church and government. And they kept to their rules, and they were influenced by their interests, their situation, and their prejudices. It would be foolish to think otherwise. To make the Bible agree with their creed, they put into their translations things which were not in the Greek or Hebrew Bibles, and mistranslated vast multitudes of things which were in the Greek and Hebrew Bibles. I will give you an instance or two. Their creed taught that God once died or laid down his life. There was nothing in the Greek or Hebrew Bibles to uphold this doctrine. So in translating the Bible, they so altered a passage as to make it to teach the doctrine. You may find the passage in 1 John 3:16. It is as follows: "Hereby perceive we the love of God, because he laid down his life for us." Now the word God is not in the Greek. It was put into the passage by the translators. In one place in the Old Testament it is said that Elhanan slew Goliath the Gittite. The translators have altered the passage so as to make it say that it was the brother of Goliath that Elhanan slew. See 2 Samuel 21:19. Before a man can give a perfect translation of the Bible, he must have a perfect knowledge of both the Greek and the Hebrew Bible, and of the language into which he would translate it. But no man has that knowledge. The Greek and Hebrew languages from which the Bible has to be translated are dead languages, languages which are no longer spoken or written by any people, languages which exist only in ancient writings. The meaning of many of the words of those languages is in consequence lost. The writings of the Old Testament are the only books remaining in the Hebrew language. There are no Hebrew books to throw light on dark passages, or to settle the meaning of doubtful words and phrases. True, we have Greek and Hebrew dictionaries and grammars, but these dictionaries and grammars are the work of imperfect and erring men, who had no other means of understanding the meaning of the Greek and Hebrew languages than ourselves. These dictionaries and grammars differ from each other. None of them are perfect. The best abound with errors. We have better means of obtaining a knowledge of the Greek language than of the Hebrew, but the Greek of the New Testament is a peculiar dialect, not to be found in any other book. It is therefore as difficult to translate the New Testament as the Old. If, herefore, we would find a Bible that does not bear the marks of human imperfection and error, we must look for it in what are called the original Greek and Hebrew. But there is no such Bible. The Greek and Hebrew Bibles are as really imperfect as the English translations. The Greek and Hebrew Bibles are as really the work of imperfect and erring men as the English translations are. Many people imagine that there is only one Greek and Hebrew Bible, and that one was written by Moses and the prophets, and by the evangelists and the apostles. But this is not the case. There are several Greek and Hebrew Bibles, and all of them are the compilations of fallible men. We have several Hebrew Old Testaments, and quite a number of Greek New Testaments, all compiled by different persons, but drawn to some extent from different sources. It should be understood that the oldest Greek and Hebrew Bibles are not printed books, but written ones. They were written before the art of printing was known among Jews or Christians. Those written or manuscript Bibles are far more numerous than the Greek and Hebrew printed Bibles. They are the work of different men in different countries and different ages, and no two of them are alike. They differ from each other almost endlessly. Some contain more, some less. Some have passages in one form, others have them in other forms. John Mills compared a number of those manuscripts of the New Testament, and found that they differed from each other in 30,000 places. He marked and collated 30,000 various readings. Other men have compared the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, and discovered upwards of 100,000 various readings. 100,000 100,000 places or particulars in which they differ from each other. A similar diversity of readings is to be found in the Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testaments. Now it is from these imperfect and discordant manuscripts that men have to make their Greek and Hebrew Bibles. They have nothing else from which to make them. And those Greek and Hebrew Bible makers have no means of knowing which of the various and contradictory manuscripts are the best. You must understand that the original writings from which the manuscripts now in existence originated have perished many ages ago. It is probable that the last of them perished more than 1600 years ago. We have, therefore, no opportunity of comparing existing manuscripts with the original writings, in order to find out which are the true, the original readings. The discordant and contradictory manuscripts, therefore, can never be corrected. It is not only of the common English Bible, therefore, that the words of the resolution are true, but of every Bible known, whether printed or written, whether in Greek and Hebrew or in modern languages. Since Mr. Barker has resided in America, he has visited England, and lectured for the secular and freethought societies in England and Scotland. The total number of lectures he delivered during his visit amounted to 153. Besides engaging in several debates, the principal one being with the Reverend Bruin Grant at Halifax, during 10 nights, on the divine authority of the Bible, which is now published. The views now held by Mr. Barker on God and secularism may be seen from the following extract of a letter addressed to the editor of the Reasoner, written by Mr. Barker from America, on February 22nd, 1853. I confess I know nothing of God, but as he is revealed in his works. With me, the word God stands for the unseen cause of all natural phenomena. I attribute to God no quality but what seems necessary to account for what I see in nature. My Jewish and Christian notions of God are all gone, except so far as they appear to be the utterances of nature. As to secularism, I think our business is with the seen, the worldly, the physical, the secular. Our whole duty seems to me to be truly and fully to unfold ourselves, and truly and fully to unfold others, to secure the greatest possible perfection of being and condition, and the largest possible share of life and enjoyment to all mankind in this present world. The machinery of sects and priesthoods for saving souls and fitting men for heaven, I regard as wasteful and injurious folly, except so far as it may tend to better men and improve their condition here. I have a hope of future life, but whatever is best for this life must be best for another life. Whatever is best for the present must be best for the eternal future. To reveal to men the laws of their own being, and to unfold to them the laws of nature generally, and to bring them into harmony with those laws, is therefore with me the whole business of man. If there be another world, as I hope, it will, I suppose, be governed by the same laws as this. If men live on forever, they will have all the better start in a future life for having got well on in this. As an art, therefore, I believe in secularism. Note by the American publisher. Soon after Mr. Barker's return from England, he resumed his lecturing in various towns and cities in the United States, giving great satisfaction by his able addresses to large and intelligent audiences. He still labors occasionally in the same pursuit, though at present he is residing on his farm at Omaha City, in the territory of Nebraska. Much might be said in praise of his efforts to promote liberalism in this country, but his greatest triumph, as we consider it, was his public debate with the Rev. Dr. Berg, of Philadelphia. This took place on the 9th of January, 1854, and continued no less than 8 evenings. The question was on the origin, authority, and tendency of the Bible. Dr. Berg affirming, and Mr. Barker opposing. This famous discussion was attended by thousands, and was probably the greatest affair of the kind that ever occurred. The speeches on both sides were published, making a large pamphlet of 190 pages. Of course, each of the debaters was victorious, in the opinion of his friends, but the trick played by the Christian party in the closing scene showed a determination on their part to claim the victory whether or no; for as soon as Dr. Berg, who made the last speech, had finished, one of his friends took the platform, and while the audience were separating, read some resolutions in favor of the Doctor and the Bible. Less than 1/4 of the audience, says the Philadelphia Register, voted for them. The more serious part of the audience did not vote at all. The great majority seemed to take the thing as a farce. The result of the vote made a good many long faces on the stage and front seats. A short silence ensued, followed by a burst of obstreperous laughter, and cries of "The infidels have it!" and so ended the most remarkable debate ever held in America. The following correct and candid report of the above discussion appeared at the time in the columns of the Pennsylvania Freeman. The Bible Discussion. The discussion on the authority of the Bible at Concert Hall, between Rev. J. F. Berg, of this city, and Joseph Barker, of Ohio, closed on Thursday evening last, after a continuance of 8 evenings. During the whole time, the vast hall was crowded with an eager multitude, numbering from 2,000 to 2,500 persons, each paying an admittance of 12 1/2 cents every evening, and on some evenings it is said that hundreds went away, unable to approach the door, nor did the interest appear to flag among the hearers to the last. Of the merits of the question or the argument, it does not come within the scope of a strictly anti slavery paper to speak, but we cannot forbear to notice the contrast in the manner and bearing of the two debaters, and the two parties among the audience. Mr. Barker uniformly bore himself as a gentleman, courteously and respectfully towards his opponent, and with the dignity becoming his position, and the solemnity and importance of the question. We regret that we cannot say the same of Dr. Berg, who at times seemed to forget the obligations of the gentleman in his zeal as a controversialist. He is an able and skillful debater, though less logical than Mr. Barker, but he wasted his time and strength too often on personalities and irrelevant matters. His personal innuendos and epithets, his coarse witticisms, and a bearing that seemed to us more arrogant than Christian, may have suited the vulgar and the intolerant among his party, but we believe these things won him no respect from the calm and thinking portion of the audience, while we know that they grieved and offended some intelligent and candid men who thoroughly agreed with his views. It is surely time that all Christians and clergymen had learned that men whom they regard as heretics and infidels have not forfeited their claims to the respect and courtesies of social life by their errors of opinion, and that insolence and arrogance, contemptuous sneers, and impeachment of motives and character towards such men, are not effective means of grace for their enlightenment and conversion. Among the audience there was a large number of men who also lost their self control in their dislike to Mr. Barker's views, and he was often interrupted, and sometimes checked in his argument by hisses, groans, sneers, vulgar cries, and clamor, though through all these annoyances and repeated provocations he maintained his wonted composure of manner and clearness of thought. On the other hand, Dr. Berg was heard with general quiet by his opponents, and greeted with clamorous applause by his friends, who seemed to constitute a large majority of the audience, and to feel that the triumph of their cause, like the capture of Jericho of old, depended upon the amount of noise made. Mr. Barker, in giving an account of the origin of the discussion, says: "In December, 1853, in compliance with a request from the Sunday Institute, I began a course of lectures in Philadelphia on the origin, authority, and influence of the Scriptures. The object of the lectures was to show that the Bible is of human origin, that its teachings are not of divine authority, and that the doctrine that the Bible is God's word is injurious in its tendency. When I sent the Sunday Institute a program of my lectures, I authorized the secretary to announce through the papers that I was willing to meet any clergyman of good standing in any of the leading churches, in public discussion on the Bible question. The Reverend Mr. McCalla, a Presbyterian clergyman, accepted the offer, and arrangements were made for a 6 nights' debate; but on the 5th evening, after trying to raise a mob, he withdrew from the contest. The clergy, or a portion of the clergy of Philadelphia, unwilling to leave their cause in this plight, demanded that I should discuss the question with Dr. Berg, a minister in whom they had fuller confidence, being assured that Dr. Berg was a gentleman and a scholar, and that he was the ablest debater the clergy of Philadelphia could boast. I agreed to meet him, and the discussion was fixed for the 9th, 10th, 12th, 13th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th of January. Though the doctor did not prove himself so much of a gentleman as I had been encouraged to expect, I was sorry he declined to continue the discussion 4 nights longer, as we had not got more than half through the question when the 8th night closed. I wished for an opportunity of laying the whole subject before the public. Perhaps some other clergyman will take the matter in hand, one disposed and able to discuss the subject thoroughly." End of chapter 23, and end of book. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers, by Charles Bradlaugh. Read for you by Ted DeLorme, in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Thank you for listening. If you like, you may follow me on Twitter at ThatDarnTed.